Hello, health champions. If you wait until you have most of these so-called early signs and symptoms of diabetes, then you already have problems that can lead to kidney failure, blindness, and amputations. That's why it's so urgent that we understand what really are the early signs of diabetes. Here's what they call the early signs and symptoms of diabetes. And that's the problem, because these are not early signs and symptoms. These are, in fact, most of them very late signs and symptoms. And since this list is widely published, chances are your doctor won't know the difference. And to make things worse, they don't even distinguish between type 1 and type 2 diabetes, which in many ways are opposite each other. That's why it's so critical that you understand the difference so you can take charge of your health before it's too late. And I'm going to go over just a few simple ideas so that by the end of this video, you will probably know this better than your doctor. Alright, sign number 1 is a slow, gradual weight gain. And this is indeed an early sign of insulin resistance, moving toward type 2 diabetes, unlike many of the other signs we'll talk about. How many people do you know, or maybe you, who say, I've been eating the same, I've been exercising the same, but it seems I keep putting on a few pounds every year? That's probably most people, and it's not because we're just getting older, it's because we are becoming more insulin resistant, moving toward type 2 diabetes. Sign number 2 is that you pee a lot, you urinate a lot. And this can happen to both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, but it is not an early sign. This would happen quite late because there is a renal threshold that the kidney can filter out glucose. You filter water and glucose, but then the kidney reabsorbs it. But there's a threshold around 180 milligrams. And you would have to have full-blown type 1 diabetes to get over that threshold. And with type 2 diabetes, not only do you have to develop type 2, but you have to mismanage your glucose to the point where it gets even worse, all the way up to 180 or above. So as your glucose rises, virtually all of it, like 99 point something percent, gets reabsorbed because glucose is precious to the body. But once you exceed that threshold, now the rest spills over. And with the sugar going out, it takes fluid with it. And of course, if the fluid's running out of you, you get really, really thirsty. So pretty much the same thing we talked about. With type 1 diabetes, it would be in a late stage. With type 2, it would also be fully developed type 2 diabetes, but it would also pretty much be mismanaged, because if you do anything to keep your glucose under 180, then you should not be losing fluid and sugar through the urine. Then there's one more type I want to include to talk about, just so we can start understanding some of these mechanisms. Diabetes insipidus is where you get extreme thirst because of extreme fluid loss. First of all, we have type 1 diabetes mellitus, and this is important to understand. Unlike the others, it's an autoimmune condition. Your immune system, your own immune system, goes after certain cells in the pancreas called beta cells. So it's like a case of mistaken identity. And your immune system destroys these cells, and then your body makes more beta cells, but the immune system has been triggered and it keeps destroying these. So it's a gradual process. It's going to usually take several years to complete the process to where the body is unable to make enough beta cells. But once that process is kind of complete and the pathology is there, now you don't have enough insulin because you don't have enough beta cells to make the insulin, and now you have type 1 diabetes. And the key about type 1 is that even though it takes probably years for the process to complete, once the symptoms come on, it's almost overnight. It's like, it seems in a few days or a couple of weeks, it's like all or nothing. And when diabetes was first discovered over 3,000 years ago, type 1 diabetes was the type they talked about. They had people who had excessive urination and who wasted away, who were emaciated. Type 2 diabetes is basically the opposite of type 1. This is insulin resistance, and this takes even longer. It takes decades for the most part, unless you have a young child and you start breaking down their body by feeding them sugar and soda at an early age, then it can happen faster. But here the problem is high insulin. If you eat a lot of sugar and processed foods and seed oils and things that trigger insulin, now your insulin levels become chronically high, your body and your cells and your tissues develop resistance to those high levels of insulin, and as you increase your insulin resistance, eventually it becomes type 2 diabetes, which is nothing more than a very high level of insulin resistance. And the interesting thing is that this used to be extremely rare. A couple of hundred years ago, the only type of diabetes they knew was type 1, but today over 90% of diabetes is type 2 diabetes mellitus, which is basically a man-made disease. But here's an interesting one. Gestational diabetes. This is when you don't have diabetes, supposedly, and you get pregnant and all of a sudden you're a diabetic. So why does that happen? It's because during pregnancy you should become more insulin resistant. And why is that? Insulin promotes growth and storage, and because you're growing a baby in you, that's a lot of new tissues, a lot of new cells that need to be filled with building materials and fuel, we need more insulin. But also, because insulin is a storage hormone, it converts fuel into fat, and baby humans need to be really, really fat. Human babies are the fattest of any species relative to size because we have the biggest brains. And if we have huge brains and fuel supply, the food supply is not super steady, we need to be able to break down fat, turn them into ketones. So human babies have lots of fat, and they're very, very fast, much faster than adults, to get into ketosis to provide fuel for that huge brain. But that doesn't mean that you're supposed to become diabetic just because you become pregnant. What's probably happening is if you have some pre-existing insulin resistance, that you're not fully diabetic, your glucose is still under control, but your insulin levels are quite high, you're moving toward insulin resistant, then it's like you're pre-diabetic, your early stages, and then becoming pregnant, changing the hormones to support the baby, adds that final push over the edge and you become diabetic. I've included diabetes insipidus just to understand the picture a little bit better. This is about a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, ADH. It's also known as vasopressin, but it has two functions. Vasopressin is, like the name implies, putting pressure on blood vessels, so it increases blood pressure. But what increased blood pressure does, it forces more fluid through the kidneys. But sometimes we're supposed to have higher blood pressure without losing fluid through the kidneys. So that's where the second function comes in. This hormone does two things. It increases blood pressure, but it also increases retention through the kidneys, reabsorption, antidiuretic hormone. So we can raise the blood pressure without losing fluid. Pretty smart, huh? But then there's people who have a defect, a genetic defect, or they have a fault or a trauma or an injury or something to their hypothalamus that produces this. And if they can't make enough antidiuretic hormone, then they can't keep the fluid in. The kidneys filter it out, but there's nothing telling the kidney to reabsorb any. So these people lose enormous amounts of fluid. There's very little reabsorption. And as a result, they have extreme thirst. They can drink 8 or 10 or 12 liters of water and nothing really helps. It just runs straight through them and they have this extreme thirst. And now we have 4 different things with the name diabetes, and yet they're very different things. They have very different mechanisms. So how did they come up with the names? Why do they call them diabetes? Well, diabetes is a Greek word that means pass through or flow through. And the first one they found, like I said, was type 1. It wasn't called that back then, it was just diabetes. And they added the word mellitus because mellitus means honey sweet, tasting sweet as honey. And the other one was when they peed a lot, but it had no flavor. That was because insipidus means lacking taste. And now you're wondering, how come they named the different types of diabetes based on taste and flavor? And unfortunately, your worst fears are true. Back in the day, they actually had to taste the urine to see what was going on. Quite a glamorous profession, right? Fortunately, today they have blood work. Otherwise, I think that the enrollment to medical school would suffer quite a bit. Now, here's the issue. We label them similarly based on the end result. Because there is flow through, they're all called diabetes, but they're very different mechanisms. Basically, type 1 and type 2 are opposite each other. However, in most doctors' clinics, it becomes like a knee-jerk reflex. It's all about glucose management. And now that you understand how they work, now you can pretty much predict why all of these are happening. If you have number 4, sudden weight loss, this is going to happen in type 1 diabetes because type 1, they eat food, they make a lot of blood glucose, but there's no insulin to take the glucose into the cell. So they're basically starving. It's called starvation in the midst of plenty. And they're wasting away. This was fatal, virtually every case, 100% fatal, until they figured out how to develop insulin. Type 2 diabetes is the opposite problem. There's too much insulin and they tend to put on weight too much. Gestational is kind of the same thing. There's a form of type 2 diabetes that occurs during pregnancy. And with diabetes insipidus, there is no relationship. There is no weight loss or gain, only fluid. Sign number 5 is excess hunger. People are hungry all the time. In type 1, it's like we said, they make a lot of glucose. They eat, make glucose, but they can't use it. So they're constantly starving. It's like they never ate anything and they're wasting away. That would be a late stage. You have to have full-blown type 1 diabetes. There's no sign along the way. Type 2 diabetes is a different mechanism because insulin is a storage hormone. And if you have a ton of insulin, then you get really, really good at storing away at the expense of retrieving. So if you have a bunch stored, then essentially your fuel becomes locked away. You can't get to it and you have to eat more. Now this could happen quite early. So this is one of the reasons that we started with slow weight gain as sign number 1, because as soon as you have a little bit of insulin resistance and elevated insulin, now you tend to pack away more than retrieve and you get hungry as a result. Sign number 6 is blurred vision. This also has to do with glucose, but it's a different mechanism. With type 2 diabetes, you can get this, and it's going to be quite late. This is often said to be an early symptom. It is not. First of all, you have to develop type 2 diabetes. Then you have to allow more time to complete a destructive, degenerative process. And what happens is you have a bunch of small, tiny blood vessels that are very sensitive in the back of the eye. And if you have too much glucose, then that tends to promote leakage and damage to the retina. In type 1, you could also get this, but pretty much you would have to allow a lot of time and you would have to mismanage it. If you get insulin and you maintain your glucose at a good level, then that should not be happening. Number 7 is tingly hands and feet. And this happens because of swelling. When you have high glucose, glucose leaks out. It takes some fluid with it into the surrounding tissues, and that swelling can hurt the nerves, the fine nerve pathways, and you get neuropathy. And with neuropathy or damage to nerves, now you also get slow wound healing. So a lot of diabetics, they have cuts and wounds that just won't heal. And in extreme cases, they get them on their toes and they get necrosis and they have to amputate and so forth. And it's because healing requires signals. Your body sends signals. There's certain nerve signals and frequencies that the brain sends to the area that needs to be repaired so that the body knows how to do that. If the nerve is damaged, then this doesn't happen properly and you get very slow wound healing. And this could happen in both type 2 and type 1, but like I said, you pretty much have to mismanage them to get high blood sugar, and it would be late and chronic. It should not happen early on. Number 8 is hypertension or high blood pressure. And unlike a lot of the other signs and symptoms that are due to high blood glucose, this is almost purely high insulin. As we can see, the type 2 diabetics have the highest insulin and 80% of them have high blood pressure. But then some people say, wait, not so fast. Type 1 diabetics also have a lot of high blood pressure problems. And indeed, about 30% of them have high blood pressure. But high blood pressure is pretty common. It can be due to metabolic issues or stress, basically. And high blood pressure is extremely common in the general population. And the US average is about 45% of people have high blood pressure. So basically type 2 diabetics have super high insulin because they're already diabetics. The US average is on their way. They're mostly pre-diabetic. And type 1s, assuming that they're managing their disease pretty well, only have as much insulin as they inject. So that would explain these numbers perfectly. And hypertension can be an early sign. It's one of the few things on this list that are actually an early sign. And as soon as you get a little bit of raised insulin, that insulin tells the kidneys to resorb more sodium and more water. So a higher fluid volume tends to raise blood pressure. And a lot of people who go on a low carb or a ketogenic diet, the first thing that happens is they drop their insulin some, and for many of them, very soon that blood pressure starts coming down as well. And again, as a contrast, diabetes insipidus, by definition, means you're losing fluids, and very often they have the opposite problem. They can't keep enough salt and water to maintain blood pressure, so they often have hypotension or low blood pressure. Number 9 is one of my favorite things to do. If you order blood work, you can find these things out. If you order the right things and you know what they mean. Unfortunately, the standard is to order glucose and maybe A1C, which is a 3-month average glucose. But glucose is a very controlled variable. The body will work very, very hard to keep glucose within a narrow range. And therefore, it will take a long, long time before it gets out of control. And if we only measure glucose, we'll find out very late that there's a problem. This is where we miss 15, 20 years of finding out what's going on. In type 1 diabetes, then the glucose is usually not a problem as long as you have some amount of insulin, and then eventually when the pancreas fails to make hardly any insulin at all, then it's like an all or nothing. The glucose shoots through the roof in a matter of days or weeks. However, I always include insulin on my blood work because insulin is used to control glucose. If we only measure glucose, we measure something that's being controlled. But if we're measuring insulin, we're measuring the thing that's controlling it. We're measuring how hard the body is working to keep it there. And glucose is almost flat for decades, whereas insulin is a gradual, almost a straight line increase. So if we measure insulin, then we're going to find out very, very early. So if the ideal level is at the bottom line here, it could double and we find out 15, 20 years earlier than when the system has completely failed. And again, with type 1 diabetes, it's like an all or nothing thing. As long as the body can make some insulin, it's going to stay constant. But once it fails, it's going to go down quickly and the glucose is going to shoot straight up. Number 10 is an expanding waistline. And in the case of gestational diabetes, that waistline is going to expand rather quickly. And of course, we can only hope that you know that you are pregnant, and that is the reason why it's growing rather fast. In type 1 diabetes, there should be no change because you're starving essentially. Everything you're eating stays in the bloodstream and you pee it out. It can't get into the cells. Type 2 diabetes, it's going to happen rather slowly. And this is just like slow weight gain and slow blood pressure increases, one of the best early signs that we can tell that we're moving toward diabetes. However, you could be thin with a pouch, you could have a normal BMI and just start growing a little pot belly, or you could be obese, you could have weight everywhere and have most of it in the midsection. So both of these would be indications of moving toward type 2 diabetes. But there's an important distinction that there's two places the body can store fat. We can put it subcutaneous, which means under the skin a little bit everywhere, like love handles and on the hips and legs, or it could be visceral, and that means organ fat. And the organ fat is the problem. That's usually more related to insulin resistance. People with subcutaneous fat could be very overweight and not really have any metabolic problems. But the visceral fat is a problem. And the visceral fat is actually much more insulin resistant. And therefore, if you have visceral fat, it indicates a high level of insulin resistance. Why is that? Because the visceral fat, the body doesn't want that to grow, because if it grows, then it puts pressure on your vital organs and it disturbs their function. Therefore, visceral organs are much more insulin resistant, and that's why it indicates a problem. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.